Turning to other news now, an Australian academic, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, languished in an Iranian jail for 804 days and has long complained she was the victim of hostage diplomacy, a pawn in a greater campaign by Iran to put political pressure on Western countries such as Australia. And she's worried Australia isn't doing enough to target Iranian hostage takers through international sanctions. I spoke to her a short time ago. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. You seem quite concerned about the stance that Australia is taking, or at least in your tweets on this matter, is not taking on imposing sanctions on some Iranian officials. Can you walk us through what the basis for your concerns are?
Yeah, so I've expressed my concerns, obviously, in the past more broadly about the need to sanction Iranian officials over the brutal crackdown of the past 5 months following the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. And, whilst the government has announced sanctions on a handful of individuals and organisations, really doesn't go far enough and pales in comparison to some of our international allies. I've been working with a British charity called Redress, which is a torture charity, actually, out of the UK. And over the past year, myself and almost 20 other victims of hostage taking of the Iranian regime have triangulated evidence and put together quite a lengthy, more than a 100-page, actually, document of legal analysis and evidence, which makes the case for using our Magnitsky sanctions regime against Iranian officials who are repeatedly involved in the hostage-taking and detention of innocent foreign citizens like myself. And this report was submitted to DFAT on the 30th of December last year. It's very comprehensive. It's written by international legal experts, and it sets out the case essentially as to why we should be sanctioning Iranian hostage diplomacy to disincentivise the practice and to make sure that this doesn't happen again to other innocent Australians or citizens of other Western countries.
And what sort of response have you had from the Australian government on that issue so far?
I have brought this issue up repeatedly, both with government ministers, MPs and DFAT officials over the more than 2 years since my release. And they are responsive. They do listen to my ideas. And, there is a general recognition, I think, both within the previous government and the current Labor government, that more needs to be done on this issue, particularly in terms of collaboration with some of our international allies. But in practice, very little progress has been made. And I was quite shocked to see in Senate estimates last month when Senator David Fawcett actually directly questioned the minister on this redress report, asking her if she had received it, asking her if she would consider potentially adding Iranian perpetrators of hostage diplomacy, people who have taken innocent Australian citizens hostage like myself, but also a number of others. I'm not the only one. Whether she would consider adding them to our sanctions list. And she'd never heard of the report. So despite more than a year of effort and work being put into compiling this dossier of evidence and making these legal arguments, the report hadn't even made its way to the minister's desk, which was quite disappointing to me, particularly coming off the back of so much engagement with DFAT and with the minister's office prior to this.
Given that this report was submitted back in December last year, we are now in March, would you have expected and we all know that bureaucracy does move slowly at times, would you have expected it to have gone across Penny Wong's desk by now?
I certainly would have hoped so, particularly given that we've just had a Senate inquiry into Iran and into Australia's lack of or lacklustre response to human rights abuses in that country in the past several months. The Senate committee released its report last month as well, and we saw a somewhat lukewarm response to that Senate inquiry from the minister's office. So this issue has been on her desk. The Senate inquiry also raised the issue of sanctions and of hostage diplomacy, actually, and also recommended that the government take more steps to disincentivise the practice because it's on the rise and it's happening to more and more Australian citizens around the world in places like China and Iraq, not just in Iran. We know we have at least one Australian citizen in prison in Iran right now, for instance, and we need to stop this phenomenon from happening. And I genuinely think that applying Magnitsky sanctions to repeat perpetrators of this practice, of this business model, is an excellent way to send a message that it's in our national interest to stand up against this and to prevent it from continuing.
One of the arguments that's often put forward by governments of all political persuasions is that they don't flag necessarily who's next in the firing line when it comes to sanctions being imposed, because that kind of takes some of the weight out of the sanctions, giving them time to prepare. Is there anything to suggest that the government isn't considering these sort of sanctions but is just not talking about it publicly?
You make a good point there, but I would say that the fact that in Senate estimates, both the DFAT officials present and the minister herself admitted that they'd never heard of the report suggests not that these names are under consideration, but that they haven't even been flagged on their radar at all. So whilst I do appreciate that, yes, we don't want to telegraph in advance to people we're going to sanction that we're going to sanction them, at the end of the day, it seems that this report has not even made it all the way up to the minister's desk. And also, I'd say that most of the names on the list are largely symbolic. They don't have ties to Australia. These people live in Iran. They'd be unlikely to have assets that we could freeze here in Australia. So it would be a symbolic step and a symbolic calling out and identifying the names and the identities of some of these perpetrators, rather than any meaningful action to freeze their assets. Obviously, we want more than symbolism. We want real action from the government on this matter, but it's better than nothing. And the fact that it doesn't appear that this report has even been really read or assessed at all at this point is very disappointing.
Well, Kylie Moore-Gilbert will watch how this situation develops in the coming weeks and months. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me on.